Zoom bombed. It was my first experience of Zoom bombing. And so this step is our attempt to be protected from unpleasant surprises. So I hope you could hang in there. I'll spend no more time in introducing who we are, as we probably know of each other. Please say hello in the chat, and to everybody, say where you are from, for those who are new. But I will start by saying a few words about who you will hear from today. So this is me, you know, Mara Airoldi, as the academic director of the GoLab. I will be your chair for today. To pace us and make sure we go through a quite dense agenda, we will hear from Juliana and Fernando together, and then we will hear from Elle and Ruri. Most of us are from the GoLab, but we are really excited. In the last Hack and Learn, we worked with a number of other institutions, and including INSPER in Brazil, the Bertha Center in South Africa, Ashoka in India, and the big center at Georgetown. So welcome everybody. I will we have a slide with the program for today, I think. We have three parts. First, we will take stock about the Hack and Learn, what we've learned. Juliana and Fernando have been working on a learning report, and they will give us some highlights, and we can have a discussion about what we learned from the past Hack and Learn. And if you have ideas on the next Hack and Learn, we will have some time to talk about those. We will have Elle talking us through the database quarterly insights. As I said, there is a quarterly cycle where we take stock, and so Elle will bring us up to speed to where we are with this last quarter. And finally, we have Ruri, who will give us a nice provocation on what we can learn from other initiatives, but I will not spoil it too much. And then we will close with some highlights on how to keep in touch and get ready for the next quarter. So I'll stop here, and I will hand over to Juliana and Fernando to tell us all about what we've learned from the Hack and Learn.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you all for joining us today. So I'm Fernando, and I'm going to present some of our learnings regarding the Hack and Learn together with Juliana. So how did we do it? So basically it started with the kickoff session back in March 11th. We had 2 times just to ease engagement of participants around the world. And in these kickoff sessions, the challenge leaders basically tried to pitch participants to engage in their challenges, explaining how they were interested and appealing challenges regarding pressing issues worldwide. The members who accepted to join each challenge, and they could even choose more than one, were added to teams in Slack. And since March 11th, they were discussing and debate. Each team decided to follow, to proceed as they wish. Some had regular weekly meetings, some other had the discussions only over Slack. So it was quite flexible. Then on March 25th, the teams gathered for the show and tell. As Mara just said, everyone were delivering the outputs. What were the difficulties they have, what were the outputs, and how they think, how they debated, and what were the insights and ideas they had in each challenge. They received feedback from the other groups and the other participants who joined the show and tell as well. Since then, we started to collect feedback from the participants and challenge leaders to have the technical and learning report that we are going to present today. We had participants coming from all around the world, as Mara said, basically all around the world, indeed, as you might see here. We have participants from Australia as well. I remember Mara told us that we miss a blue marker here in Australia, for instance. And the challenges this last Hack and Learn, we have 9 of them, and some resemble the challenges from the last Hack and Learn, and some others were quite innovative. So basically, I'm not going to detail each of them because later on I will present some examples of outputs. But we have challenges aligning OBCs, the outcome-based contracts, with the UN SDGs, regarding user voice, governments awarding outcome contracts, girls' education, vaccination in the US, the Impact Wayfinder, which is a tool we have in the GoLab website, Indian NGO ecosystem service provider, also visualizing donations inflows to India, and the last one, the Impact Bond pipeline. So 9 quite different but complementary challenges. And next slide, I'm going to show some examples of outputs we gathered. Then what did we do? For example, the user voice team had this infographic summarizing how do impact bond projects involve service users, basically. Here we have an output from the OBCs and SDGs team showing how different contracts connect and relate to the different SDGs. This is a good exercise. As we look to the Sankey diagram, we might see how SDGs relate differently to contracts, and we might perceive synergies between SDGs and OBCs. Here we have the distribution of donations across states and districts to India, so social, educational, religion, and other areas according to the distribution of donations in flow. This is another team. Here we have the vaccination team, vaccination regarding COVID in the US, and they developed a user journey map. This helped them to identify pitfalls and drawbacks whenever an user might have difficulties in the process of getting the vaccination. And lastly, as an example, and I remind you that we have several other outputs here regarding this and other things, but we have the Impact Wayfinder. This is a prototype yet, but it is already available on the GoLab website. And the idea here is to help anyone who is interested in impact evaluation to find an evaluator. You basically have to answer a few questions, and this will guide you regarding potential evaluators to your project. So Juliana, please.
Yes. So thank you, Fernando, for your presentation. What I'm going to do now is to tell you a bit more about the report that you can see here. This is the cover page of the report that we've been preparing together with Fernando and other participants and other challenge leaders from the Hack and Learn. Fernando is going to drop a link to this report in the chat. So if you're interested, you can look for the link and you can download it and read it, and of course you can send feedback about it. The report is structured in 3 different sections. The first section is about the Hack and Learn in general. It's a description of what happened in the Hack and Learn, who are the organizers, who were the co-hosts and the institutions who were behind this Hack and Learn, and what were the challenges that we were working on. And I'm not going to spend much time on that section because Fernando has already did it. So I'm going to go straight to the second section. The second section is mainly about participants learning, and it has a description of the outputs of every hack team, but it also has, and you will realize it has different blue boxes in the middle of the text. And those blue boxes are telling the stories of personal experiences of different participants who came to the Hack and Learn and learned something important. And I really think that those blue boxes are the most interesting part of this report, because they tell the story of people who came from all around the world, from very different backgrounds and with very different ideas of what they wanted to do. And they got a very important lesson or several lessons from this event. So I'm not going to tell you all the learnings because I will not have time. You can see here 2 very short examples from Nora from the Big Center and Hillary. These are just 2 examples. You will find many more in the report, but these stories are great. They tell the story of participants who developed better data skills in some cases. There were other participants that said that know nothing about outcome-based contracting, and now they are very interested in the topic. There are also stories of groups who are thinking of theories and frameworks to better understand understudied topics in our field, such as the user voice team. There are many more stories. There were lots of different learnings, and I really encourage you to download and read the report if you are interested in this type of events. But this is not all that we learned. The co-hosts and challenge leaders, we also learned a lot. And we decided to categorize our learnings in 3 different categories because there was a lot of repetition. So challenge leaders tend to realize that they learned or they improved their organizational skills. There were also very important learnings in terms of leadership skills. We also agreed to say that the Hack and Learn is also a very good networking opportunity, because apart from working and hacking, we could also get to know people who are doing research in the same field as we are, or maybe people who are interested in the same things that we are. So it was really a good opportunity to meet new and interesting people. And what are the next steps? So as we did last year for the last Hack and Learn, we would like to incorporate some of the products into our GoLab website. For example, the SDG prototype or the network diagrams are part of, or are a product of, or a main idea of the first Hack and Learn. So we want to do the same with the second one. And we really want to stay connected with the participants. So we encourage you to keep using your Slack channels. They will remain active. You can sign up to our INDIGO mailing list, and you can keep attending to our INDIGO quarterly peer learning sessions. And of course, you can engage with us using Twitter. This is our Twitter handle. There will be more information coming soon about the next Hack and Learn. And I really want to take the time to thank you all for coming and joining us for the last Hack and Learn. It was great to have you here and hack all together. We look forward to continue working together. And now that I'm going to hand over to Mara again, I want to leave you with some questions to start a short discussion about what things do you think we can improve or we can change for the next Hack and Learn. Maybe you have an idea of new challenges that you would like to address, or maybe you have an idea of improvements that we could start thinking of. So I'm going to leave the word. I'm going to hand in to Mara because she's going to facilitate the discussion, but I really encourage all the people who participated in the Hack and Learn to share their reflections with us. So over to Mara.
Thank you so much, Juliana and Fernando. That was a very nice refresher on what we did. So I'll repeat Juliana's question. Raise your hand. It's too many of you for me to see all of you in a gallery viewing. So please use the raise your hand button that is, if I remember, in your participants tab, right?
In the reaction tab.
In the reaction, sorry, I use too many software and I don't know which one is which anymore. Thank you. In the reaction, and we might, I'll come to Elle in a second. I just want to warn Gautam, I would like to come to you next as one of our co-hosts to get us going on reflection on how did it feel for you and what might be something we want to do next time to make it more successful. Elle, your hand was up.
I was just wondering how people felt about sort of picking up some of the same challenges again for next time, because I thought that some of the thinking was just getting going when we needed to maybe think about next steps, and I wanted to see how people felt about having the next version of challenges as like one step on from what we did this time around.
Sure, happy to share my thoughts. As Elna rightly mentioned, I think both of the projects that CSIP hosted, we would love to continue it to the bring it on for the next cycle as well, because partly the work needs to be done as in that's one part of it. Additionally, I think having access to a diverse pool of resources via the Hack and Learn was something that was new and really motivating for me as well, seeing the rapid sort of organic organization that Slack teams sort of did over the past over the 2 weeks of the Hack and Learn was really inspiring, and we managed to get a lot done. I think learnings, as I shared earlier in the session, I think instead of hosting maybe parallelly 10 challenges over a fixed period of 2 weeks, maybe we could have a Hack and Learn season of sorts, wherein 2 weeks for 3 projects, and then you take a break, and then everyone sort of reconvenes, and then you select and sort of run the 3 projects again. So I think that would greatly help members to contribute more to individual projects and also learn more about the ecosystem. I think those would be my 2 bits.
Thank you. This is a great suggestion. So like working in sprints. So every sprint covers a number of challenges. Duly noted. On a suggestion, I can see Ian in the chat agrees that maybe we want to cover some of the same challenges because there was momentum. Anybody else? I have Rory, you are following the chat more than I do because I'm checking for a hand being raised. Did you see any interesting question you want to bring to in plenary?
I'm getting a lot of people agreeing with the idea of continuing on. People saying it just got started. I appreciate Gautam's comments about phasing them. I also observed that Gautam was the only one bold enough to sort of be challenge champion on 2 different challenges. So that might be influencing his perspective here. I wonder if the 2 weeks the right amount of time? If we are doing the Hack and Learn at the conference in September, which I think we are, then there'll be some run-up period. And one question I have is the idea of how much run-up do people want before a show and tell at the conference? Do we want to do an intense 2 weeks before the conference, or do we want to do two sets of sprints of 2 weeks before the conference? Feedback on that issue would be very welcome as we design the next Hack and Learn, which will culminate in something at the conference.
Just to sort of respond to Rory, yes, initially I think getting the sense of 2 challenges and sort of coordinating both was challenging. But apart from that as well, I think in terms of Slack activity and sort of member sort of time in which they could sort of devote towards particular projects, even though we had like 10-15 participants in one particular challenge, effectively we had 4 people sort of actively working. So just that it's the problem with buffet, like you have too many good items to choose from, and so you want a bite of everything. So I think that's what happens. So that's why I suggested the phasing.
You want to be able to go back up to the buffet table?
No, I share the concern with Gautam because I like many challenges and I sign up to many of them, but I could actively contribute to 2 or 3. And I have to confess, I sign up to more than 2 or 3. So I like to sign up to them all and contribute significantly. I want to share, I was working with Ian and Mayra and some of you here on the challenge of creating a pipeline of projects. And our plan is to continue creating the template of this pipeline in line with the creation of potentially a list of projects that are in the pipeline that the Impact Bond Working Group is launching. So I don't know if other challenges also have key milestones in their diary between now and September, because we will be interested to maintain active relationship in the community around particular milestones. So if you have milestones, if there is a way to announce them or this challenge will work on the following task, and there is a tentative deadline, this conference, this event where we would like to have made this much progress so that you can invite people through the Slack channel so they are aware. That would be great to share.
Yeah, I agree. There's an excellent point being made, I think, in the chat, that if we do have lots of energy around existing things and people are continuing that work, we have to think carefully about the on-ramp for new people. So whether it's new challenges or being able to integrate new people into the existing things, one of the, I mean, if it wasn't a hack and learn, one of the things that and it was a regular program, you would have thought carefully about documentation and training and on-ramping of new people. That's not something that, within a 2-week period, I think a lot of people had time to think about. You were sort of there, you picked it up from the Slack. So integrating new people into the existing challenges, I think, will be an important thing to do, because we want the new people to sort of feel welcome and understand quickly what's going on. So, thanks for that point.
Thank you. Any other suggestion? Do you feel, anybody feel strongly that we missed the challenge? And this community might be really helpful to reflect on how to use data in a different way. Okay, it seems that we are roughly on the right ballpark. So if there are no particular comments, please feel free to add comments in the chat as we go along, as ideas come up, or email them to the INDIGO email address. If you don't have it, can we, Laura or Juliana, can we put the email of INDIGO in the chat? And I'd like to move us to the second part of our meeting today, and where we are looking at the quarterly insights for this last quarterly cycle. And I'm giving the floor to Elle to present some of the highlights. Elle.
Great, thanks, Mara. Hi everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Elle Carter, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about some of the highlights from our Impact Bond Quarterly Insights publication. So the Impact Bond Dataset, I think, is really the flagship, well, it's the first, certainly, of the INDIGO datasets. And we have been working with the community of Impact Bond stakeholders around the world to develop a shared and open set of definitions for Impact Bond projects and to compile a standardized set of Impact Bond project level information that's accessible and useful. So this is really where the community and the data of the INDIGO project kind of come together to produce insights. So we are working to produce a kind of quarterly insights publication on an ongoing basis. And we hope that what this will do is show the latest developments across the global landscape of impact bond projects, but that we want to also be able to use it to spotlight particular developments or insights within the data, or particular additional, like, richer bits of data that might be coming on stream, as well as putting that alongside interpretation and analysis from the INDIGO community. So we really want to bring together the latest developments from on the data side with a bit of discussion and a bit of critical thinking around where this is going and what this is telling us about the landscape here. So we've been playing with a few different ideas for what this quarterly insights piece can look like. We think that maybe on a rolling basis, it should have a core set of headline information. So that will enable us to see the key trends over time. But we think it would also be nice to have some of these analytical spotlights to highlight particularly novel analysis. I'm really keen to draw in thoughts from you in terms of what some of that could look like. So here's a bit of a flavour in terms of where our thinking is at. I also wanted to be really open and candid about the data and analysis that we have today, because even this map is tricky. So this map shows the global distribution of impact bond projects around the world. But currently on our website, you'll see that there's actually a pin for every delivery location. So for impact bond projects with multiple delivery locations, there are multiple pins. And so if you zoom out to get this global picture, it actually gets a bit messy. So the tally of delivery locations is actually a fair bit bigger than the count of impact bond projects. So be interested in thoughts on how best to calculate and display some of that. So this particular graphic we have built specifically to show the count of impact bond projects in different locations around the world, but we could potentially rework the live map to do some of this as well. And then we have some key stats on the global impact bond landscape. So the INDIGO dataset now shows 206 impact bond projects with a total value of investment that's committed to these projects in the order of $458 million US. And we think that there are over 846,000 people who have either been involved in a project or are expected to participate in services supported by these impact bond projects. So they're the headlines, and we can also start to produce some time trends. We thought this might be interesting for the community. So this chart shows the investment amount committed to impact bond projects over time. So the line shows the cumulative investment figure, and the bars show the annual amount of investment committed, where that date of investment is connected to the start date of the impact bond service. So you can see there's actually a bit of bumpiness there in terms of the trend, which is interesting. And then I also wanted to highlight some of the new filters and features that we have. So in addition to the impact bond level data sets, we now have a new outcomes fund directory. So that's accessible through the top right of that page there on the website now. So this describes the outcomes funds which might be making payments to support the delivery of impact bond projects. Another one of the things that we've been grappling with is different types of impact bonds. So we have social impact bonds, development impact bonds, and everything in between. So I'm really pleased that James Ronicle is able to join us to offer some reflections on the messiness around some of this. But first, let me just describe some of the updates that we have made to try and bring a bit more clarity here. So one of the things that we have is an outcome payer filter. So this identifies projects where the outcome payers are non-government organisations, and so we can more easily see impact bonds where outcomes are paid for fully by government payers, and we can also see those where philanthropic organisations are acting to pay for outcomes, and we can also see where there's a mix blending government and philanthropic outcome payers. And we've also been working on a bond type filter, which makes a distinction, and this is new, between domestic and international impact bonds. And we might not have the language right here, so this is very much a prototype for, for feedback. So we've made these adjustments in response to some concerns around the term development impact bonds. So not only did we think that that was potentially disempowering, but there was no standard definition or a shared understanding of a social impact bond compared to a development impact bond. So we've worked to try and tidy up the data so that we can see international impact bonds. And these are projects where at least one outcome payer is located in a different country to service delivery. And then we also have domestic impact bonds where outcome payers are all located in the same country as service delivery. So we hope that this, in combination with the outcome payer classification, brings a bit of a clearer distinction to the discussion around different impact bond arrangements. So you can see now the international impact bonds that are held on the INDIGO dataset around the world. We've identified 13 of these international impact bonds where at least one of the outcome payers is based in a separate jurisdiction. And we can also then begin to describe the distribution across different policy sectors of these projects. So I was actually surprised to see that health-focused projects are the most common of these international impact bonds, followed by employment and training, then education and poverty reduction projects. And the final thing that I wanted to mention is that, oh, maybe it's obvious, but all of these insights are very dependent on stakeholders sharing granular information on their impact bond projects. And when more of the underlying data is available, then we are also able to show some new visualizations. So these are all available online, but I've just taken a snapshot of the timeline visualization on the next slide to show how that works with a sample of the Life Chances Fund projects in England. So here the red bars represent the duration of the service from the start date to the anticipated end date, and the blue bars represent the duration of the Impact Bond project from the date of the final Life Chances Fund sign-off to the expected end date of all of the outcome payments. So I hope this is helpful to give a sense of how long some of these outcome contracts are and how that might vary. So this is something that we've been newly able to show for the Life Chances Fund, and we can also begin to show the network of organisations involved in these impact bond projects. So we have an interactive version of this network map available online, but here this shows the constellation of actors and the connections between them with a bit more clarity. So the blue circles are impact bond projects, and the small dots are different types of stakeholder organisations. So outcome payers, social providers, investors and intermediaries are all coloured differently, and every organisation is connected to all of the projects that it's working with. So you begin to get a sense of how prevalent some organisations are in the ecosystem. So if an organisation has lots of connections, then they're connected to lots of different projects, and you can see their place in the landscape. And while we're talking about data, I don't know if Vera's on the line, but I wanted to give a big shout out to Vera from Portugal Inovação Social, because Vera has just compiled really detailed dates and network information for all of the projects across Portugal. So we'll now be able to see the landscape of impact bonds in Portugal with a real appreciation for their connections and timelines. So big thanks to Vera for that. And finally, I just wanted to say, if you want to offer a particular interpretation of this data, or you have thoughts on what this quarterly impact bond sort of insights piece might look like, then please do get in touch, as James did. So James, I know that you have thoughts on impact bonds and DIBs and are, you know, in contact with the team working on some of this. So do you want to just talk a little bit about your thoughts on some of these tools and where things are going?
Thanks, Elle. Yeah, I think Elle invited me along because perhaps my claim to fame is I'm probably the most prolific user of the Impact Bond database. I use it at least once a week. I used it yesterday because I'm meeting Sport England and I wanted to know what sports SIBs there were. I used it on Monday because I was doing a presentation on SIBs in Latin America, and I wanted a graphic on the SIBs in Latin America. And as Elle said, it's an ambitious project, but the devil is often in the detail. And because I use it so frequently, I sometimes pick up quirks or things that I think could be done differently. So I try and be constructive. And so every time I use the database and go, oh, I really wish it would do this, I hassle Rory and Juliana and just say, by the way, I really think it'd be excellent if the database does this. It's all supposed to be constructive. I've built websites myself, and you imagine user stories. Well, I am your user story. So I'm trying to give you real life user stories. So I hope they're always taken in the sense that they are. And if I'm irritating you, just tell me to go away, because I do have other things to get on with. So that's fine. But I think what Elle asked me to talk about is where, yes, I do probably contact them every 2 months or so. And I was in a meeting with EBRD probably about 4 or 5 months ago, and they asked me in the meeting, what is the largest DIB in the world? And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know the answer to that. So I was trying to buy time and was quickly going on your database to try and find out the answer to that question. And I couldn't find out the answer to that question because there was no way of filtering DIBs. So I think I knew the answer anyway, but I just had to, I couldn't use your database in the period when I needed to use it. So I got in touch just to let you know this. And that ended up in a really interesting debate between me, you, Juliana, and Rory around, well, what even is a DIB? How do you define it? How do you go about putting the filters into this? And the team, you know, I think you spent far more time than I thought you were going to on try. And so I'm sorry if I gave you a load of work in trying to address this challenge. You even came up with what you thought was a definition. You passed it, you sent it to me, like these are the list of DIBs as we define them. I offered commentary on them. I think we came to a point we both agreed on. It's very hard because I think the joke is a DIB is whatever anybody calls a DIB. So to actually come up with a definition and map it is really, really hard. But I think you've done a great job, and I agreed with all of your list, bar possibly one, but I totally agreed with why you went to do that. I have more user stories, so if you want more, I can give you them. For example, on Monday, I wanted to do a map of it, but it was a webinar for the Latin American audience. So I kind of thought, oh, the map that you use is a bit of the kind of Eurocentric Europe right in the middle of the map. I would think if I'm going to present a map to Latin America, I kind of think I should use the map where North and South America are in the middle. And I couldn't do that. I could scroll across, but not all the way. But I reckon if you just did a left click, so you could shift the map all the way, then you could centralize the map on whichever bit you wanted. So I've got constant views on it, but I think you're doing a great job. And I've really appreciated the kind of collaborative way that you kind of fed back to me on how you were taking on board my feedback and other things. So thank you.
I think on this last point, we have James Buster on the line who can answer, because I nagged him many times on the map, the fact that it's Eurocentric, and it's not as easy as you think, James. James, is it possible to, James Buster, to have more flexibility on how we represent? Sorry for cold calling you.
That's okay. I don't know off the top of my head. That'd be interesting to have a look. But yeah, we did spend a lot of time looking to different map presentations before, because yes, we are aware that we don't want to present a biased view. We want to try and present an unbiased view as much as possible.
So homework for us. So thank you, James, for sharing your experience. Glad to have such a loyal user. I have Rory who wants to ask a question.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to James. Thanks very much for that. You know, it wasn't lined up, but it's very appreciated. And actually, user feedback really, really welcome. So you know, getting use cases from lots of different people is very welcome. I'll put a call out there for interpretations. I think it's really good to get practitioner interpretations of like what do these things mean. So we're not just showing pictures on the infographics, but it'd be nice that some of those blue boxes that Juliana talked about throughout a quarterly report with practitioners sort of describing what they're seeing or what we're seeing and how they interpret it. So, you know, hearing from individuals who want to do that with us in these quarterly reports, I think is really, you know, it's helpful. You know, lots of lines changing, you know, it's kind of, sometimes it's difficult to interpret what's going on. And if somebody reminding, you know, like, hey, I know that performance line is changing shape, but actually COVID happened right there. So, you know, there's more meaning than you might be missing. So those kind of comments in a report like that are really helpful. And I think that they're very welcome.
Thank you. Any reflection? I really like the definition, and I raise my own point, and I abuse my chair in terms of clarity of definition. So for instance, every single time I see capital raise, I ask myself, do we mean capital to pay for outcome funds? Do we mean upfront capital? So I think there is still work to do, and I need to look up on the definition. It is all there. Rory, is your hand up from before? Oh
yes, it's up from before, but I see discussion in the in the chat about definitions changing, and that is something that you know that's important here, the definition thing, and maybe Juliana, we could share a link to the dictionary, because we have been doing some work with the dictionary and continue to do work with the dictionary, and in the same way that, you know, James's story about like, I wanted some information, I wanted a filter on this. If somebody is trying to apply you know, these shared definitions with their project and they find it doesn't work, that's really helpful information. Like, you know, the feedback on the definitions that like, hey, this definition is incomplete or is not working, you know, would love to help on that and hear that too.
Thank you for the link. We have also provocation from Andrea, who said that we are trying to come up with tight definition. in a world where the bar keeps moving. So is this the impossible task that we try to define what is an impact bond, what is a development impact bond, but then this is a very dynamic environment, so the definition will become obsolete very quickly. There is a debate on, okay, so there is a debate on capital raise and how you count it, that needs to be outed. Elle, can you explain the challenge and how we solved it?
Well, I think this picks up on Andrea's point as well, and I think it's a bit of a glass half full, glass half empty. Like, will we ever have fixed all of the definitions? Probably not, because I think that these projects are so flexible and we see evolution in the model all of the time. So I think we'll need to treat this as a really live discussion and be open about the refinements that we think we need to make in order to give meaningful definitions that help people interpret, you know, what's going on and what's new, if you like, in terms of the way outcomes contracting is evolving. On the recycling of investment, I think we don't have a very good set of tools to try and describe situations where an investment maybe is being made into a project, and then as outcomes are paid and outcomes are achieved on the ground, that payment is then moving through the project again. So it's like, well, is that investment, or is that an outcome payment, or is it a bit of both? Because we've got this kind of repurposing and reuse of capital within an impact bond system. I mean, that's hard. We haven't I don't think we're describing that very well at the moment, but it would be great if people have thoughts on how we can describe this, then we would love to hear from you, because I think that's how we get better at describing these things.
Thank you, Elle. Sergio, can I put you on the spot? Because you have a very extensive database on impact bonds and outcome-based contracts in general. And so you or Sandro, I would really welcome your reflection on what do you think is really, really helpful, something that has worked in your experience, and you might think we are not quite there yet. So like, oh, you know, we have this other variable and it's very helpful, you don't have it, or this is something of the thing that we do that is very helpful, you might want to do it too, or other things that you saw that were particularly helpful to the sector. And then I would like to move the discussion on the report that we are preparing, Elle, and get some feedback on what are the things that you are most curious on and looking forward to find in this report, like what will be most helpful. So Sergio, how are we doing? What can we steal from your experience?
Thanks a lot, Mara. Thanks a lot for the excellent presentations and discussions. Yeah, as Mara mentioned, we here at Insper Matrices in Brazil, it's a research group focused on impact investing and measurement. We have tried to compile this database of outcome-based contracts since 2015. An important difference from the database of the GoLab is that we try to track all contracts announced, not only launched, and also we try to track also not only the typical investor-based model contracts like CIBs or DIPs, but also more direct pay-for-success contracts, such as public-private partnerships or contracts, concessions, etc., where providers are paid according to outcome metrics. The latter are much more difficult to find, because CIBs tend to be more advertised, right? They're hot. I mean, everybody talks about CIBs and so on, but we try. And in terms of the definition that Eleanor mentioned, we actually we define, or first we separate broadly between contracts where there's an investor that absorbs part of the risk, right? CIBs or DIBs. In the case of CIBs or DIBs, there's an investor saying to providers, well, we will not be repaid if the project is not successful. So that's our first kind of separation in the database. The separation or the definition of that of a DIB, I agree, it's confusing, and DIB is not a very good term. I mean, it's really confusing. But we simply say that it's SIBs are funded, the outcome payer in the SIBs is a government. The outcome payer in the DIBs could be nonprofits or multilateral organizations like the World Bank. In terms of this last comment by Eleanor on the separation of investments and outcome payments, I agree. It's really hard to get this information. I mean, it's really hard to get detailed information on SIBs anyway, right? Any type of information, but this is really hard. The way we do in our database is to have a column or a variable with the return, the expected return, and the coverage of the payment, right? I mean, because if you say that the investors invested, I don't know, £5 million, and the return is supposed to be 3% from the point of view of investors, right? I mean, this means that on top of the cost of the project or the investment, they will get this extra payment. What we don't know, which is very important from a value for money perspective, is how much the government actually benefited, right? We don't have this kind of information. That would be great. But we don't have this information, because the whole idea is that you create social value for money, and part of it will be split with investors. So anyway, those are great questions. We ourselves are struggling with those things, but it's great to see all the other experiences as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. I'm curious to know how well you're doing with gathering information on returns. They are always pointed out as very sensitive, at least in our community.
Lots of missing values. Yeah, lots of missing values.
An interesting feedback we had from our stakeholders is that if you have returns and you want to report them, it's important to benchmark them to the interest rate of the bank in the country where the project takes place, because a 5% return in a country means something completely different than another country. And also that was a very good suggestion. Like when we have them, we need to benchmark to what is a meaningful return for an investment given the risk of a particular country. Thank you for your suggestion, Sergio.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
Sorry. I'm reminded that there's an investor in the UK, Big Issue Invest, who worked with us on a prototype. I'm going to share a sort of link to that prototype right now. And what they were interested in doing is sharing information about the transactions as well as things like returns. So it's part of their business model, I guess. They're trying to not saying this is the best business model or the only business model, but part of their business model is, I think, is to share this information. And so we developed ways of describing the transactions and the J curve. And so that there's some model there for doing this, and there are prototype definitions there that might be interesting to people. Feedback on that is really welcome. I mean, because obviously every investor is doing things slightly differently. How differently, I'm not sure, but very open to feedback on that prototype.
Thank you, Rory. So on the chat, please follow the link and send any feedback you might have to the INDIGO email address, or now if you have. I just want to note that in the chat there is a lot of uploading on the fact that the data dictionary can help us use definition in a more consistent way, which is one of the big recommendation that Ecoris made in the UK some time ago on a report. All this definition are all over the place. Can we agree on one? And thank you to Sylvia to tell us to be more brave and just put out this definition, even if the world is changing, and to Jordan, who says maybe you need to also point out that this is also known as, there are different terms, so we reduce confusion. So you might know this out of called in a different way, but in this database it's all embedded in this definition. Any burning question before we move to our provocation from Rory, because it hasn't been enough provocative today? Okay, Rory, I think the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. So my name is Rory McDonald, and I'm qualified as an engineer in New York. I don't practice though. I work as a researcher at the Go Lab. I'm focused on this initiative and an initiative called the Oxford POGO Club, which is the Procurement of Government Outcomes Club, not the mode of transportation. If some of this stuff is interesting to you, it's being done as a working, as part of a working group under the POGO Club. And our next session is about system level learning, and it's on the 27th of April. We also have the conference coming up, and some of the, if you want to be involved in this discussion on a panel in the conference, let's talk, and we'll try and put together, a panel. The call for papers closes on the 30th of April. Anyway, my provocation is, hey, payers, also buy the data and release under an open license. If you go to the next slide. So this first part is really sort of probably annoying, the sort of payers idea. When I'm talking to governments, I've said, hey, govies, because I sort of really want to draw the attention of people who pay for the outcomes. So in a development impact bond, this might be the development impact bond, or we talked about the definition earlier. This might be an FDDO, this might be a philanthropic organization, but that's what I'm calling upon here. Go to the next slide. I'm also saying, look, let's make it really clear what data we want. If I know that there's some things that are people feel they're entitled to, but I think it's really helpful if the payers are really clear up front. Yes, we want transparency, and here's what transparency looks like to us. Like, let's have that conversation with the marketplace. I'll get into that a little bit more later. And third, let's release it under an open license. This is the sort of least controversial thing. There are open government licenses, or there's Creative Commons. There are there are clear things to open it up. Go to the next slide. So that first part, I think that it's important to note here that one of the things we talk about in impact bonds is that, yeah, we're getting public sector and private sector and maybe the third sector to work together here. Well, in the public sector for a long time, particularly internationally, there's been a lot of movement towards transparency, and so I think it's helpful for those in the public sector to say to entrants from the private sector, to say to financial firms, like, hey, welcome, here are our cultural norms. We've been working on transparency issues for a long time. There are issues with the transparency. There are including some confusion and rules around exceptions to Freedom of Information Act, and there are similar Freedom of Information Act things around the world. But welcome. We're in a place where we want to be transparent, and here's what transparency looks like. One of the great things about people from different sectors coming together is there's an opportunity for harmonization of norms. If we go to the next slide. For example, in the UK made a commitment as part of the Open Government Partnership National Action Plan, and there are some issues with the UK and the Open Government Partnership, but let me highlight that one of the commitments was providing transparency and open contracting guidance to the parties in social impact bonds to help improve this public contracting mechanism. You can see that we're sort of in a place where these impact bonds exist in a context of transparency, open government, open data, and a lot of work that's being done in this space. If we go to the next slide. Something else that's happening in the UK context is reform of the public procurement system post-Brexit. One of the reform initiatives, which the government has published a green paper proposing changes It's called Transforming Public Procurement. Chapter 6 is focused on ensuring open and transparent contracting. There's an extension of the open contracting data system, OCDS, to be used within sort of UK contracting. That's the kind of shift that we're seeing. And so again, all this work, this mix between public and private organizations focused on social issues, this is happening in the context of reform that includes an attention to transparency and openness. We go to the next slide. Okay, my second point is also by the data. So while there are moves, policy moves about what data must be released, we're talking about projects that are happening now. We're also talking about projects happening in lots of different places around the world. So I think it does make sense to be really clear and open with with partners what kind of information you want when you want to do an impact one. And the earlier you do that, I think the better. So if you're setting up an outcomes fund, there was a section previously, but outcomes funds under which lots of these might happen. But I think having a conversation early about the types of things you want to share, is helpful. I note that there's model contract language from the UK government around services contracts that includes the sort of idea of having requiring transparency reports and an appendix at the back, and that's kind of helpful. And I'm thinking about that in this context. If you go to the next slide. So points that are at issue here. So again, I've mentioned this list of data you want shared among the parties, a list of data you want shared openly. You can discuss data if you're doing a flexible procurement procedure or some kind of application process. I think the idea here is that open data is not free. The people involved in the project collecting and sharing data sort of need to resource this. I'm not saying the government should spend lots and lots of money, or the outcome payers should spend lots of money on doing the data sharing. Actually, I'm hopeful that the transaction costs for these things go down if there's more clarity. But I think it's important to say, look, these are the data elements that we want. I think that helps clear up things that might come down the line, like, that's commercially sensitive. Well, if you get into that conversation early and say, well, these are the things we want to buy, or the organization is allowed to say, well, these are the things we want to share, then that I think is helpful. Something to acknowledge is that data may not exist in a raw form, and so there is work to sort of look at the data dictionary and definitions and square this up. And so giving people time to do that, I think is helpful. So what data elements might you share? One doesn't have to use the INDIGO list, obviously, but there is a data dictionary that this community is developing. And so one could sort of focus the attention of the parties on these things. So it's like, these are the things we want you to share. If you go to the next slide. So what my suggestion is that, a document such as this, and this is something that we're still working on in a working group within POGO, is this idea that, I've just shared a link to it there, this idea that, there's a template document that you could attach to your tender notices or your program guidance or your contract. If you go to the next slide. And it's set up as follows. So it's got the definitions, and there are many definitions, but you could reduce or change the definition. It's also got a default here that everything should be open. So we want all of these things, but it allows the offerer or our parties to say, well, actually, I don't want to report this. My model doesn't allow me to, or it's part of my, it just doesn't make sense in my system. It adds too much cost, whatever. They could mark like, no, we don't plan to report this. And there's a place over on the right for you to say why, and you can engage in that discussion. We also talked about, okay, so those things you are reporting, here's the frequency of the report. This is something we want quarterly. Okay, this is something we want at the start or changed. We also are thinking about, okay, It's fine. We're now providing, the service provider or the prime social contractor or the SP, the special purpose vehicle is now providing these reports to the outcome payer. But what about, the extent to which those data can be shared? So here we've got columns to address this. We're saying it could be shared with everyone by default, but in one column, you can mark it if you don't want it to be shared with the public, then you can have that conversation, or you could mark it that you don't want it to be shared with other parties. Again, the default is sharing, but I think it makes sense to try and clarify these issues up front. If you're somebody that doesn't want to share with the other parties, let's be transparent about that. Let's talk about it early. If you're somebody that doesn't want to share with the public, let's be transparent about that. But I also recognize that it might be that you find this data element and it just doesn't make sense for your model. Maybe it's about it's about an RCT and you don't have an RCT. So it doesn't make sense to share that. So just you would note that, have that conversation. Anyway, I'm going to pause. Oh, sorry. The final point, thank you, is about releasing it under an open license. So once the outcome payer or the prime contractor has the outcome payer has these data that they want to be able to release it, and they can decide how to release it. There are lots of models for releasing data. This is not a sort of controversial place. The UK government has an open government license. Many governments have their own sort of open license. A very common thing, if you go to the next slide, is the Creative Commons license. It's free to use license. You sort of download the thing. But that allows people to know that they can in fact share and use this for commercial and non-commercial purposes. And that's pretty straightforward. Okay, so what some of the discussions or feedback I've had when sort of chopping this idea around and sharing with other people and getting improved by other people, is that so what data to share really matters and when also matters. So it'd be helpful to have that discussion. If we go to the next slide. Okay, so just to conclude, my provocation, which happened in an earlier workshop, is sort of like, hey payers or hey govies, also buy the data and release under an open license. I think that's, yeah. Okay. I think we lined up a couple of people to give a response. So I think Jordan and Jen might be available to give reflection. Is that true? Is that helpful?
Yes. So Jordan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think this is really important. I think we've had these discussions, Rory, we've had these discussions before about kind of, we are kind of, as FCDO, we're kind of really committed to transparency, and we see the importance of it. Being part of the hack and learn and stuff, it kind of showed me it from the other side. So normally I'm on the government side and seeing it from the other side. So kind of seeing the barriers that kind of you come up against when this data is not available. So I made a couple of notes. So on the template, we kind of realize the importance to harmonize this data collection, but we want to make sure it's not a burden. So I like the idea that kind of you can go off and say, no, we're not going to share this, and kind of give a reason why, and then potentially that data they give as to why they're not sharing the data also becomes really important. So then we can kind of figure out ways in which to overcome that. I think you made a good point on the on that as well, in terms of what we collect is really important. Like, make sure that it's relevant. People that are involved in impact bonds and outcome funds, they often have a really high workload. Not saying that everybody doesn't, but so making sure that what we're asking them for is relevant and making sure that we're not adding to their workload. And then when to collect it as well. I think that's a really important discussion. And I had a conversation with Charlie this morning about kind of the idea that some people involved, some suppliers, some service providers, they might not be happy to share commercially sensitive or financial data. So then how do you overcome that? So do you do that kind of after they finished. So kind of whilst they're not active, so then they can't be kind of like come under like being undercut and whatnot, or is that too late? By the time they finish, is having that data by that point kind of too late? Is it then out of date kind of time? So yeah, as I'm going to go back to the transparency point now. So yeah, we take this really seriously, but we know obviously across Whitehall, it's not as consistent. FCDO, I like to think, are kind of leading the way in terms of transparency. But I've worked in other government departments that aren't so kind of happy to share data. So I think that's something we should overcome and need to overcome. So this is theoretical, not making any promises or any commitments, but I think potentially what we've seen work in the past is kind of cross-government working, and this has worked in other areas I've worked in on. So having a community of practice maybe across to share best practice and kind of make sure that data is being kind of shared openly and transparently, and also making sure that it's used effectively. I think that's one thing we need to make sure. I have some small points for that. It's just really small, but we can come back to that probably out of this conversation. And then I was talking about the open licenses, and kind of I think that's important to kind of figure out when and what's important. I realise that I've kind of not gone in that in a kind of logical way, but if you have any questions or want to discuss anything I've said, then happy to.
Thank you, Jordan.
Mara, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can hear you.
So thank you. So you're not making any promises, but we took duly notes, and the session is recorded. Jen, do you want to share your reflections on Rory's provocation before we move to the other participants?
Sure. So my take on this is to ask who is the data for, and why would they want it, and also is the provider of the data the same as the intended beneficiary, because that's going to have big impacts on the incentive structures that you're talking about here. And I think this falls into kind of potentially three different pots for me on how data is published and used, particularly when you're thinking about commissioning and contracting. So one is, are you thinking in evaluative terms? So is the benefit of collecting this data and providing this data that it helps you to analyze the value of the contracts themselves, the impact bonds? Is this a contractual thing? So it's just something that you want included as part of all of your commissioning, these kinds of commissioning contracts, so it just becomes second nature? Or thirdly, is it more virtue signaling and performative? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an important point to make, that a huge amount of open data publication has been driven, it has been incentivized by performance. It's been incentivized by being part of the group that publish their data. And I think certainly that's been the case in grant making in the UK. 360 Giving, the use that 360 Giving data is put to is minimal in the extreme. And most of the organizations who provide that data do absolutely nothing with it. So I think it's trying to think about those sorts of questions in order to encourage people to do this. Are you intending to, is the idea that you're trying to push, what kinds of usages are you trying to encourage, and who for? Because I think those would affect how you would think about structuring this, whether you want it in that very contractual way that you presented it there as something that is just appended to everything, or do you want to incentivize people to use this data differently? So do you want people to be able to do things with it? What's the benefits to having comparative data? It seems very clear to this group that there's huge benefits in having comparative data. It's not necessarily particularly apparent if what you're doing is running a single social impact bond. So I think understanding those different elements and where you want to align this approach, where you want to align your data publication, do you want to align it with evaluative practice, in which case there is a case for paying for it, right? There's a sort of standard that you would pay for evaluation alongside government contracted work. That's a kind of a norm, certainly in the UK. So you could say that the data sits alongside that and is an essential part of it, and that therefore having the standard terms is a big part of seeing that, and then, you know, work to get it into the Green Book and everything else. Or do you want to see this as a fundamentally contractual issue, that you want data to be collected in a certain form because government stipulates that that is the case, and then you can get away from really thinking about usage? Or is it really about that performative thing? This is a virtue. You want people to think that this is a good. They are contributing to a social good by doing this, and therefore that's much more about the community side to it, and it's about them feeling good whether or not they put it to use.
Rory, do you have an immediate reaction?
Yeah, no, thanks very much for all these responses. I appreciated Jordan's attention to the question of when do we share these data. You know, as a research institution, you know, we've got various obligations, including obligations to our you know, research subjects, so to speak. And we want to make sure that projects that we work with and look at are not harmed. And I could see an argument whereby, you know, if somebody's going through it, you know, a difficult, you know, they've got a challenge with performance that they're trying to address, also having to deal with the sort of external transparency things might add some burden, and actually there might be a, you know, logical reason to give some time between the release of information and you know, and the sort of the heat of the moment when you're trying to sort of problem solve, because we want people to problem solve rather than do performative things. To Jen's point, but moving to some of Jen's point, I think you're right. Like, being more explicit about the benefits and the costs of transparency, I think, is really helpful and important. And more work needs to be done there, I think. The use cases that we have identified are, you know, include our own sort of use cases as researchers, but also we've heard from people who are interested in setting these things up of like, well, I'd like to see what they are. Where are they? Who's involved? How long do they take? Should I make them really long, short? These kinds of things. And we see that the people who are setting up outcome funds and talk about setting up impact bonds talk about learning and, you know, as being an important thing. And this, I think, is a helpful thing for learning. So I think there are use cases that are valid and to be articulated, but my suggestion is to use the contract as a mechanism to do that. There's legitimate, you know, scenarios where companies say, like, this is commercially sensitive, and, you know, there are exceptions to freedom of information rules, and then they say this is, you know, this is really sensitive, we don't want to share this. But that's something I think it's really helpful to get explicit at the start. And so if you as the outcome payer have this vision that lots of data will be shared and lots of learning will be happening, then it's helpful for you to be able to articulate and say, this is one of the things that we want you to do in the course of this contract, a performance here. And this is, you know, and that's helpful then when you're evaluating offers. I think that's helpful when people are saying, well, I can do this, but not that. That's easier to have that conversation at the start, although there is, of course, then some time taken there. Then sort of expecting to have lots of data, and actually at the end there are no data because everybody's like, well, actually that's commercially sensitive, and it might have been more helpful to have that conversation earlier. I'm not following the chat, so if somebody wanted to pull up the chat, but
Jordan has a question.
Yeah,
and
no,
in the chat, can I highlight that Rodan agrees with you, Jordan, that there is a community of practice to share information that needs maybe to be re-energized. So Jordan, your point.
Yeah, I mean, I love a good community of practice, being involved with some, but yeah, as Rodana says, having to champion each organisation to make sure they actually kind of work and kind of progress. I like Rory's point of putting this into the contract, but you said earlier about maybe putting it into the tender documents really right at the start, so they know kind of what to expect before even bidding for it, or bidding to be part of anything. I think that's a really good idea. Because then you're clear about what you want and when you want it and why you want it. But yeah, once again, it's about showing that even at that point, is showing what is the value add of this, and showing why it's important that it's kind of involved. But yeah, I mean, not everybody is kind of like us here, and they don't see the point in it. So it's about being clear, and it's about showing that yes, okay, this might add some work onto what you're already doing, but it is important. But yeah, no, I just wanted to say, and into tender documents, so even before they get to contracting, it's a really good idea.
Yeah, and if you're setting up a program under which there will be lots of things competed, maybe it makes sense to have that as one of the sort of overarching outcomes fund program thing. Some of this debate about costs and benefits is playing out within the UK and public procurement more broadly. So you know, in this sort of chapter 6 of the Green Paper that's talking about increased use of the open contracting data standard for all public bodies, you know, that are doing public contracting. That's helpful for citizens and many people, but the burden often, on a local authority in a particular transaction, you can understand why an individual commissioner who's got a limited budget for like helping care leavers or something, is thinking about, well, let's help this care leaver. This extra work that I have to do about transparency, is that why am I incurring the cost when the benefit is to society more broadly? So who bears the cost, I think, is an important thing as well, because there are costs associated with gathering the data, and I caught sight of a discussion earlier about, are we funding are we paying for the data, or are we paying for the work? I think we're paying for the work, but it's the data that it's easier to describe. I'd rather describe the outputs, like, hey, price, I'd rather describe outputs rather than sort of the inputs of like, spend 5 hours collecting data a week. I'd rather say, hey, can you share these data? So anyway, I'm gonna pause there. Other people have points.
Yeah. No. Yeah, sorry, I completely agree, Rory. And I think so as I was reviewing kind of presentation this morning, is there's the offerer, and then I can't remember the wording for the person basically showing who is responsible for collecting the data, but then who is responsible for ensuring that the data gets to where it needs to go. So having two kind of clear roles. So like the service provider is the one who's going to be providing the data and making sure that we're kind of getting the data that we want and is relevant. But then it's up to the other party to ensure that is kind of, enforce might sound a little bit strong, but making sure that data is collected when it is collected. So having clear definitions of that on the roles. I did have a note on that. So the reporting contract from the offerer, just having clear kind of roles and responsibilities for those two parties.
Thank you, Jordan. Any other point from the audience? We had a bit of a discussion on who should pay in the chat and what type of data, which was already discussed. And L, clarifying the need of data stewards, which is something we are working on as something that is very much needed to get the information in the right places and quality assured to an extent for uniformity.
Yeah, I'm struck by, or reminded by, about the project we did with Big Issue Invest that I mentioned earlier. One of the people involved in that project on the Big Issue Invest side sort of remarked, like, we're not data dragons. We don't have all these data. Like, the data are in different places. We have these things for our purposes, but these data are elsewhere. And so it would strike it, the idea that one could easily just go to one party and say, give us all this data, it would be flawed, right? Because they may not have these data, but and there's confusion around, among the parties about, well, who owns this data? And that's the question that really frustrates me. The sort of people who are working with these data, and they're like, well, can I share this? Who owns this? And when we have, I hope that this kind of conversation, whether it's through the contracting mechanism or the procurement or the setup of the program, these conversations earlier help clarify some of those issues.
Yeah, I think one of the contributions that we can make probably is different depending on different legal jurisdiction, is clarifying how it is decided who owns which data and who has the power of sharing the data. Because when we were working with the community, often there is a confusion, like, yes, I do have the data, but I don't know if I can give it to you. And so offering like what are the normal guidelines and what is the legislative position might be a very, very helpful pragmatic tool.
But that's why I think it should be in the contract of like, we want to buy these data from you, so please make sure you're, because we plan to release it to everyone, but we are going to take ownership of this as part of this contract is the solution that I'm suggesting here. I do see a conversation between Jen and Elle happening in the chat, and maybe it's helpful to surface conversation about evaluation and what that means. Does Jen want to?
Jen, do you want to start your? Would you want to share your provocation, and Elle, your views? Jen?
Well, I was responding to something that Elle had said about learning and evaluation sounding as if it's wafty, I take to be easier than collecting and compiling data. And I was just going to say that, I mean, a huge amount of evaluation does involve compiling large amounts of data. So it could well be that the perception is somewhat distant from the reality. But yeah, the reason I mentioned evaluation is not so much for the terminology as because it is an accepted part of many government contracts for which there are almost, there's sort of rules of thumb of how those would be paid for. So it used to be the case, and this is also true, for philanthropists. So depending a bit on where the capital is coming from, this is an accepted route. So whether it's just whether if what you're trying to do is to do two things: one, ensure that a bunch of information is collected, and two, that information is paid for. One thing you can link that to is something which is an established practice, which is paying for evaluation. So do you, and whether you, I'm not saying necessarily you lump it in as part of that, but is there something to look at there? And the reason I say that is also just from familiarity with evaluation contracts in my field, where a huge amount of what the independent evaluator is doing is often collecting programmatic data, which the organizations would otherwise not have. So a huge amount of the kinds of data that you're analyzing, to down to the amounts of each individual grant and the purposes and uses of that money, this is all often collected by evaluators and analyzed by evaluators. And that's partly because the UK grant sector is broken, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Jen. I was reflecting actually on the questions around who, and the who is actually, quite a complex group of people on this. And I think Rory's provocation around, getting this established through the contract is maybe a helpful way to appreciate the constellation of people who need to be up for this. My point around data and evaluation, I feel slightly scarred by the fact that government departments are paying for evaluations that can't be done because there isn't the data and there isn't the willingness to share the data. So government, in several cases on these things, is wasting money by paying for researchers to scrap around and not really do anything, because there's no shared appreciation for what this data is or how to get it out. But maybe we do need to work harder thinking about, but what are the connections between evaluation activities and the reporting the signalling of the reporting expectations that are agreed between the parties to outcomes contracting projects. And I was also reflecting on the kind of the costs and benefits of this. The costs are seen to be very real, I think, in terms of the headache of compiling this and working through it all, whereas the benefits seem more ephemeral, and we're not so articulate, I think, in describing, you know, in terms of cold hard cash, the learning benefits or the insights that might be unlocked through some of this. And maybe, I don't know whether we need to go down this very capitalistic, we need to put pound signs on learning, or whether we just need to, you know, construct our arguments in a more compelling fashion, but in other ways.
Thank you, and Jen, for these provocations. So I have to say, I'm conscious of time, and Rory is adding some thought in the chat, but I want promise you to keep this to 90 minutes. So I just want to remind you how you can contribute going forward to the work we've been doing with Indigo. Today we had a lot of insights. So we talked about the hack and learn, what we learn and how to make it better next time. We are taking on board your suggestion, maybe looking at sprints and way to onboard new members and having work ongoing between now and the next. Look forward for the report. So there will be core and in-depth elements. Great to be encouraged on our work on definitions. And great to see in the chat excitement about our network diagram and bringing it to global. And thank you for this conversation on transparency. I think there is a lot of work here, but it's encouraging to see that there is a coming together, a coalition of the willing. And so let's be very clear on which data we are thinking to share for which reason, and then make sure that outcome payers own it, and so have the ability to share it without much complications. From now, here are 5 ways to contribute to Indigo in the immediate. 1, you can share your data in the usual way. We can you can contribute to our discussion on how to improve this data and improve this data definition. We will keep the Slack channel open, so keep joining the challenge, provoke the channel lead on things that you'd like to that you want to do in the interim and how you want to contribute. If you are a coder, everything is there. Take it, improve it, change it, and please do share the word. Invite people to join our mailing list and our events. Another way to, another date to keep in your diaries is our conference in September. It's the 9th and 10th of September. It's likely to be a hybrid conference, so we will have a contingent in Oxford if it's possible, but you will be able to join online as we become very good to have a hybrid in-person, virtual in-person conferences. But bear in mind, at the end of April, there is the deadline for submitting papers, and you can also submit ideas for panel sessions. So if there is something that you really care about, please get in touch with us with your suggestion. And if you're writing a paper, the deadline is the end of April. And finally, for those who might not know, we are quite a vibrant community, and we have some social events at the end of our Hack and Learn. So if you want to join, our social event is going to be next week on April 29th, which is a Thursday. Is usually a fun time where we share lessons learned in the most funny way possible, and there is also a competition. Every year somebody wins. After every Hack and Learn, somebody gets a cup for the most weird Indigo thing that they can bring to the table. So it is a way to bring back humor to our community. Last year, Sue DeWitt got the cup because she had an amazing Indigo hat, just to give you a flavor. So it's a nonsense that will be shared and celebrated forever. If you want to join, usual way, contact us on the Indigo email address, and we will just go wild. I just stop here. I want to thank everyone for participating, and in particular, our co-hosts for the Hack and Learn, and those who shared insight today. So Juliana, El, Ruri, Fernando. Thank you. And Jordan and Jen for responding to our transparency provocation.